Xylia Brooks had learned that silence had a texture. Not the comfortable silence of a Sunday morning or the soft quiet of a sleeping house, but the kind that pressed against your skin like a held breath. The kind you built deliberately, brick by brick, over 7 months of learning how to become nobody. She'd gotten good at it. She'd gotten terrifyingly good at it. The Northside Community Health Clinic didn't look like a place where ghosts came to hide. It was ordinary in the most deliberate way: scuffed linoleum floors under buzzing fluorescent lights, a corkboard near the front desk layered with pamphlets about blood pressure and community food drives, chairs upholstered in that particular shade of gray that existed only in waiting rooms and government buildings. The receptionist had kind eyes and a name tag that read Deborah. She smiled at Xylia the same way she smiled at everyone, without curiosity, without recognition, and that anonymity, that beautiful, unremarkable anonymity, was the whole reason Xylia had chosen this clinic over the newer one closer to the shelter. Closer meant familiar. Familiar meant visible. And visible, for Xylia Brooks, formerly Xylia Castiglione, a name she had spent 7 months trying to surgically remove from her identity, was the most dangerous thing in the world. Brooks. Deborah called, already looking back down at her screen before Xylia could even stand. Brooks. Her mother's name. Her grandmother's name. Hers again, finally. She rose carefully, both hands wrapping around the handlebar of the twin stroller like it was the only solid thing left on earth. In a way, it was. The 2 boys nested inside, Kai and Kenzo, 4 months old and blissfully unaware of the careful architecture of secrecy their mother had constructed around their small, perfect lives, slept with the total abandon only infants could manage. Kai had his fist curled under his chin. Kenzo had kicked one sock off again. Xylia had stopped trying to keep it on. She maneuvered the stroller through the waiting room with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned, through sheer exhaustion and necessity, how to navigate every doorway, every narrow corridor, every suspicious glance from strangers who saw a young black woman with 2 mixed-race newborns and let their eyes ask questions their mouths were too polite to voice. She had answers for none of them. "Right this way," the nurse said, already moving. Xylia followed. "Before we go any further, if you are someone who loves stories about dangerous men undone by love, about women who choose themselves even when it costs everything, and about the kind of second chances that don't come wrapped in roses but in hard truths and harder choices, then you are exactly where you need to be. Hit that like button right now. Subscribe to Mafia Moonlight Tales so you never miss a chapter. Drop a comment below and tell me your city. I want to see how far this story travels. And if someone sent this to you, share it back and let them know the story is just getting started. Now, let's go back to that hallway. The examination room was standard: a padded table with crinkle paper, a rolling stool, a diagram of the human skeletal system on the wall that Xylia had memorized over 4 separate visits. She parked the stroller beside the table and lowered herself onto the edge, rolling her neck once against the tension that had lived there since, well, since before the boys were born. Since before she'd packed 2 bags at 3 in the morning while the men she'd married slept 4 rooms away, surrounded by men with guns and the particular stillness of a house where everyone knew better than to make noise. Since before she'd understood, fully and finally, what it meant to be loved by Vane Castiglione. She pressed the thought flat. She was practiced at that too. Vane. Even the shape of his name in her mind felt like touching something that had once burned her. He was 34 years old, Korean by heritage, American by upbringing, and criminal by every definition that mattered. The heir to the Castiglione syndicate, a name that had no business belonging to a man of Korean descent until you understood that his mother, Park Ji-yeon, had married into the family the same way Xylia had, dazzled, disarmed, and dangerously in love before she'd understood the cost of the invoice. Unlike Xylia, Ji-yeon had never left. She had become the family instead. She'd raised her son to inherit an empire built in shadows, and Vane had inherited it completely: the power, the precision, and the absolute, iron-cold certainty that what was his stayed his. Xylia had spent 2 years believing she was the exception to that rule. She had spent the 7 months since learning she was not. She had met him at a fundraising gala she'd had no business attending, a last-minute favor to a friend who'd needed a +1, a borrowed dress that fit almost right, and a room full of people who all seemed to be in on a conversation Xylia didn't have the vocabulary for. She'd been 26. A junior urban planner at a nonprofit that paid in purpose more than salary. She'd been standing near the shrimp cocktail when the energy in the room had shifted in that subtle, unmistakable way that told you someone significant had arrived, before you even turned to look. She'd turned to look. Vane Castiglione had been wearing a charcoal suit that fit like a second skin, the collar of his white dress shirt open just enough to suggest the beginning of the tattoos she would later learn covered most of his left side, intricate, deliberate ink that mapped something between family history and personal mythology across his skin. His jaw was set. His eyes were the particular dark that looked almost black in low light and showed their true depth, a warm, complicated brown, only when he was close enough to matter. He had been looking directly at her. Not the way men sometimes looked at her, the quick scan, the recalibration, the decision made in 2 seconds. He had looked at her the way people looked at things they intended to understand. Slowly. Thoroughly. Like she was a problem he found interesting. She should have found another shrimp cocktail station. Instead, she had smiled. 14 months later, she had married him in a private ceremony attended by 40 people, none of whom she had chosen. She had understood, walking down that aisle in a gown that cost more than her car, that she was stepping from one world into another, and that the door between them did not lock from her side. What she had not understood, not yet, was the full weight of what that meant. The guards at the gate. The conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. The way Vane's affection ran parallel to his control, warm, genuine, and absolute, so that being loved by him felt, on good days, like standing in the most protected place on earth, and on bad days, like being a treasured thing behind glass. She had asked him, once, quietly, if she could visit her mother alone. Without the car. Without the 2 men who appeared wherever she appeared. He had looked at her for a long moment, and then he had said, very calmly, "That's not something I'm able to give you right now. Not won't. Not no. Not able." As if her freedom were a resource he genuinely wished he could provide, but the logistics simply weren't cooperating. She had started planning her exit the following week. That had been 8 months ago. Now she lay on a clinic table 4 months postpartum, listening to a nurse run through an intake checklist. The clinic nurse, young, efficient, a ponytail and purple scrubs, moved through the standard intake without flourish. Temperature. Blood pressure. Weight, which Xylia was still adjusting to the reality of, 4 months postpartum and running on institutional shelter meals and sheer determination. "Dr. Okafor will be right in," the nurse said, tucking a tablet under her arm. "The twins are gorgeous, by the way." "Thank you." Xylia said it the way she said everything now, quietly, without invitation for follow-up. The nurse left. The door clicked shut. In the stroller, Kenzo stirred, made a small sound of complaint, and settled again. Xylia watched him until his chest rose and fell in the easy rhythm of deep sleep, and something in her own chest loosened, fractionally. They were healthy. They were here. She had done this, had carried 2 lives through the most frightening year of her existence, had delivered them in a hospital where she'd signed in under a name no one was looking for, had brought them home to a shelter room that was 12 feet wide and contained everything she owned, and they were healthy. That was the only scoreboard that mattered. She leaned back against the wall and closed her eyes. Just for a moment. The exhaustion was not a new visitor. It lived in her joints, her eyelids, the space behind her sternum where something that used to feel like hope had been gradually replaced by something quieter and more durable, resolve. She had built a small, careful life in the 7 months since she'd walked out of the Castiglione estate with 2 bags, a prepaid phone she'd purchased with cash 3 weeks prior, and the knowledge, confirmed by a drugstore pregnancy test taken in a gas station bathroom 40 minutes away, that she was carrying Vane's children. His children. Children he did not know existed. Children she had decided, in that gas station bathroom, with her hands shaking and the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, he would not know existed. Not yet. Not until she was somewhere he couldn't reach. Not until she had built enough distance that the news couldn't be used as a leash. She had found the shelter through a number a crisis counselor had slipped her 6 months before she'd finally used it, a woman named Sandra, soft-spoken and perceptive, who had noticed the careful way Xylia moved through the world and said nothing except, "If you ever need this, it's there." Sandra had not asked questions. Neither had the shelter. They had given her a room, a caseworker, and the address of this clinic, which offered services on a sliding scale and kept no records that cross-referenced with any database Xylia had reason to fear. She had done everything right. She had been so careful. The appointment proceeded without incident. Dr. Okafor was warm and unhurried, her examination of the twins methodical and reassuring. Kai had gained weight beautifully. Kenzo's mild reflux was improving. Both boys were hitting their developmental markers with the aggressive competence of children who had, apparently, inherited their father's refusal to do anything halfway. Xylia did not say that part out loud. "You're doing an exceptional job," Dr. Okafor said, making a note on her tablet. "I mean that sincerely. 2 infants alone, that takes a particular kind of strength." "You do what you have to do," Xylia said. It was the truest thing she knew. She was almost at the exit when she felt it. Not a sound. Not a movement she could point to. Something older than logic, the specific frequency of threat that the body learns to recognize when it has spent enough time adjacent to danger. The hairs along the back of her neck rose in a single, silent wave. Xylia's hands tightened on the stroller. She looked up. At the far end of the corridor, past the nurse's station, past the water fountain, past the corkboard with its cheerful pamphlets about prenatal vitamins and domestic violence hotlines, a man had just rounded the corner. He was tall. Black suit, no tie, the collar of his shirt open in that way she had once traced with her fingertips on a Sunday morning when the world had still felt like it might be forgivable. His dark hair was swept back from a face she knew better than she had ever wanted to, the strong jaw, the slight furrow between his brows that meant he was looking for something, the tattoos climbing his neck above the collar, the ones on his hands visible even from here. He hadn't seen her yet. His eyes were scanning the hallway with the systematic efficiency of a man accustomed to finding things. He was not rushing. He never rushed. Vane Castiglione moved through spaces the way water moved around stone, steady, inevitable, and absolutely certain of where it was going to end up. And then his gaze reached her. He stopped. Not the polite pause of recognition. Not even the cold halt of a man who'd planned for this moment. He stopped, fully, completely, the way a machine stops when something has interrupted the signal it was built around. His jaw tightened. His eyes dropped from her face to the stroller. To the 2 small heads visible above the blankets, with their identical sleeping faces and their father's unmistakable bone structure. The silence in the hallway expanded until it was the only thing left. Xylia did not move. Could not move. 7 months of careful, exhausting invisibility, and it had come to this, a fluorescent-lit corridor in a community health clinic, her son sleeping peacefully between them, and Vane Castiglione staring at her across 20 feet of linoleum with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger. Not possession. Something cracked open. Something that looked, God help her, like devastation. His mouth formed her name. No sound came out. And Xylia Brooks, who had spent 7 months learning the texture of silence, felt the entire architecture of her carefully constructed world begin to fracture, not with a crash, but with the slow, irreversible sound of something that could not be rebuilt the same way twice. Nobody moved first. That was the thing Xylia would remember later, not the words, not the moment it all unraveled, but the terrible stillness that preceded it. 2 people in a 20-foot corridor and 2 sleeping infants, and the world holding its breath like it understood the weight of what was about to be said. Vane moved first. Of course he did. He crossed the distance between them the way he did everything, without hesitation, without performance, and stopped just short of the stroller. Close enough that she could smell the faint trace of cedar and something colder underneath it. His eyes dropped to the boys again, and something moved across his face that he didn't bother to conceal. She had never seen him not bother before. That, more than anything, frightened her. "How old?" he said. Not a question, exactly. The voice of a man assembling evidence. Vane. "How old are they, Xylia?" 4 months. She watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. Watched him count backward with the precision of a man whose entire business depended on numbers adding up correctly. Watched his jaw tighten when they did. "I want a DNA test." The words were quiet. Controlled. The control cost him something, she could see it in the cord of muscle along his neck. "I want it done today. I'll have someone here within the..." "Look at them." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She watched his gaze return to the stroller, To Kai's small fist tucked under his chin, to the particular architecture of Kenzo's sleeping face, the strong brow, the shape of the nose, the bone structure that had no business belonging to anyone but the man standing 2 feet away from her. Vane went completely still. Whatever he'd been prepared to say next, he didn't say it. The silence stretched. And in that silence, Xylia watched something shift in him, the demand dissolving before it could fully form, replaced by something rawer and far more dangerous than anger. His hand moved, almost involuntarily, toward the edge of the stroller, then stopped. Like he'd caught himself reaching for something he hadn't yet been given permission to touch. "You knew," he said finally. The words were low, stripped of everything except the wound underneath them. "You knew when you left." "Yes." "You ran knowing you were carrying my sons." "Yes." His eyes came up to hers then, and what she saw in them made her chest ache with a grief she had no right to feel, because it wasn't fury, and it wasn't cold calculation, and it wasn't the dangerous quiet that preceded consequences in the Castiglione household. It was something she had never once seen Vane allow himself in 3 years of marriage. It was the look of a man who finally understood that the person he'd lost hadn't run from him. She'd run to protect something from him. "The family business," he said softly. Xylia didn't answer. She didn't have to. The week that followed had a rhythm Xylia hadn't consented to but couldn't seem to disrupt. Every morning, she would pull back the curtain above the small radiator in her room and find the street below unchanged, the car, the rotation of quiet men, the lights burning steadily in the building next door where Vane had apparently decided to install himself like a splinter she couldn't quite locate beneath the skin. Every morning, she told herself she would contact the shelter director, explain the situation, find a way to make it stop. Every morning, the boys needed feeding, and the paperwork for her housing application needed attention, and the caseworker had a 9 o'clock slot she couldn't afford to miss, and somehow the confrontation kept not happening. On Wednesday, a woman from the shelter named Rochelle knocked on her door and told her, with barely concealed bewilderment, that someone had anonymously covered the building's outstanding heating repair bill, the one that had been tabled for 3 months, the one that meant 2 of the ground floor rooms ran cold enough to see your breath. Xylia stared at her. "Anonymous," Rochelle repeated, with the tone of someone who found the anonymity unconvincing. That evening, Xylia typed a message she spent 20 minutes composing and 30 seconds deleting. She typed it again. Deleted it again. Finally sent, "Stop." His reply came in under a minute. The furnace was a safety issue. She set the phone face down on the cot and sat with her hands pressed flat against her thighs. The thing about Vane, the thing she had spent 3 years navigating and 7 months trying to forget, was that his control had never been crude. It hadn't been loud. He hadn't needed to raise his voice or make explicit demands, because he operated in a register far more difficult to argue against: provision. Anticipation. The removal of problems before she could articulate them. It was the architecture of a man who had learned, in whatever cold schoolroom his childhood had been, that the most unbreakable cage was one the occupant found genuinely comfortable. She knew this. She had always known this. She pulled Kai into her lap and held him against her chest, breathing in the particular warmth of him, feeling his heartbeat against her sternum, solid, indignant, alive, and tried to locate the clean edge of her anger. It was there. It was real. But underneath it, pressed flat and reluctant, was something else. Something she catalogued with the grim honesty of a woman who had stopped lying to herself somewhere around month 5 of sleeping on a shelter cot, the knowledge that since the moving truck had arrived, no one had approached her in the parking lot. No unfamiliar car had idled too long on the corner. The low-frequency dread she'd carried between her shoulder blades for 7 months had, incrementally, without her permission, begun to loosen. She hated him for that most of all. Kenzo started crying at 11:47, and by midnight, Xylia knew it wasn't hunger. She knew his hungry cry, short, rhythmic, indignant in the specific way of someone who considered a delayed meal a personal offense. This was different. This was the high, wavering sound of a baby in genuine distress, and it pulled her upright before she was fully awake, her hands already moving toward the cot where he lay with his small face scrunched and radiating heat she could feel before she'd even touched him. Fever. Real fever, not the mild warmth of an overfull stomach or too many blankets. She took his temperature twice because the first reading didn't feel real. 103.1. She sat on the edge of her cot in the dark with the thermometer in her hand and the number on the screen and Kai stirring in the bassinet beside her, and she breathed through the specific terror of a mother alone at midnight with a sick infant and no margin for error. She had the pediatric nurse line. She had the after-hours number from the clinic. She had, technically, everything she needed. What she didn't have was a second pair of hands. She was reaching for her phone when she heard the knock. 3 times, quiet and deliberate, the way someone knocks when they already know it's late and don't want to frighten anyone. Xylia froze. Then, because the alternative was ignoring it and she recognized that particular cadence in some humiliating, cellular way, she crossed to the door and opened it. Vane stood in the hallway in a dark shirt with his sleeves pushed to the elbows, no jacket, no armor of any kind. He looked, for the first time in her memory, like a man who had simply gotten up and come as he was. In his hand was a small pharmacy bag. "I heard him through the wall," he said. Not an apology, not an explanation. Just a fact, delivered quietly. She stared at him. "You can hear through the building shares a ventilation system." A pause. "I had the pharmacist on call pull infant fever protocol. Dosage chart is in the bag." She should have closed the door. She understood that clearly, in the part of her mind that had spent 7 months constructing careful boundaries. But Kenzo was burning up in her arms and Kai had started whimpering and there was a dosage chart in that bag, and she was so tired that the tiredness had become its own separate entity, something she carried alongside herself like a shadow. She stepped back. Let him in. What followed was not graceful. Vane Castiglione, who commanded rooms and moved men with a word, stood in the 12-foot space of her shelter room and looked at the 2 cots and the single lamp and the careful, meticulous organization of a woman who had made a life inside severe limitations, and something in his expression shifted in a way he didn't catch in time to conceal. She watched him see it. All of it. The worn edges, the institutional walls, the systematic competence of a woman who had been carrying everything alone because there was no one else. She watched the realization move through him like weather. He didn't say anything. He just held out his hands for Kenzo, a question, not a demand, which was new enough that it stopped her, and she, after a moment, passed him over. Vane held his son with the stiff caution of someone handling something irreplaceable, and Kenzo, running 103-degree fever and entirely indifferent to the geopolitics of his own existence, grabbed his father's finger and held on. The boss persona didn't crack loudly. It didn't make a sound at all. It simply, quietly, began to give way. The call came on a Thursday morning, and Xylia knew something had changed before Vane said a single word. She knew because he was already outside the shelter when she came through the front doors with the stroller, which was unusual. He was rarely visible before noon, preferring the particular power of presence felt rather than seen. But there he was, standing on the pavement with his phone in his hand and an expression she hadn't seen in over a year. Not anger. Something older and more complicated than anger. He looked like a man who had just been reminded of exactly what he came from. "My father knows," he said. Xylia's hand stilled on the stroller handle. She had thought about this moment. Had catalogued it somewhere in the mental file she kept of threats ranked by severity, and Park Sung-jin, the original architect of the Castiglione Syndicate's eastern operations, the man who had built the family's infrastructure across 2 continents before handing the keys to his only son, occupied the file's top shelf without competition. How? It doesn't matter how. Which meant one of his own men. Which meant the perimeter he'd built around Haven House was not as airtight as he'd presented it. She filed that away too. What does he want? Vane looked at the boys for a moment before answering. Kenzo, fully recovered and apparently bearing no grudge against the universe for his fever, was examining his own fist with intense concentration. Kai was asleep. He wants them acknowledged, Vane said carefully. Formally. Within the family. The words landed with their full weight. Xylia understood their architecture immediately. She had spent enough time inside that world to know that acknowledged within the family was not a sentimental gesture. It was a designation. A placement. The beginning of a claim that, once registered in those circles, did not get unregistered. No, she said. Xylia. That is not a conversation, Vane. That is a door, and once it opens, she stopped. Steadied herself. I didn't spend 7 months in a 12-foot room so that your father could decide what my sons are called and what they're being prepared for. He was quiet for long enough that she could hear the street around them, a bus, someone's radio, the ordinary sounds of a world that had no idea what was being negotiated on this pavement. "He'll come regardless," Vane said finally. "If I don't manage this, he manages it himself." "Then manage it." "That's what I'm telling you I intend to do." His voice dropped, and she heard something beneath it she wasn't prepared for, not the measured control she'd learned to distrust, but something rawer. A man drawing a line, perhaps for the first time, against the thing that had drawn all his previous lines for him. "I'm telling you so you understand that I'm choosing a side, and I need you to understand which one." The street noise continued around them. Xylia looked at him for a long moment. "Words are easy," she said quietly. "I know." He didn't flinch from it. "I know they are." The neutral property turned out to be a townhouse in a quiet residential neighborhood, brick facade, window boxes with actual flowers in them, a street where people walked dogs and left recycling bins out on Tuesday mornings. Xylia had inspected it twice before agreeing, walking every room with the systematic attention of a woman checking for exits, for cameras, for the subtle signatures of surveillance infrastructure she'd learned to recognize during 3 years of living inside it. She found nothing. Which didn't mean nothing was there, but it was the best available approximation of good faith, and she was tired enough to accept approximations. She gave him the rules in the kitchen on the first morning while the boys were still sleeping. No firearms on the premises. No associates inside the door. No calls taken in rooms she was occupying. And she placed a box of diapers on the counter between them with the deliberateness of someone setting down a legal document. He would do his share of the night feeds and changes, without delegation, without exception. Vane looked at the box of diapers. "All right," he said. She had expected negotiation. The absence of it unsettled her in ways she didn't examine too closely. The first diaper change happened that evening. She talked him through it once, without mercy or cushioning, the way the shelter nurse had talked her through it 4 months ago when her hands had been shaking and the instructions had seemed designed by someone who had never actually met a newborn. Vane listened with his full attention, that focused, absolute attention he usually directed at things with considerably higher stakes, and then he tried. Kai, who was placid by temperament and generally cooperative, chose this precise moment to fundamentally renegotiate the terms of his own cooperation. What followed was not something Xylia had planned to find funny. She had a strict personal policy, carefully maintained across the last 7 months, against finding anything about Vane Castiglione charming. But there was something about watching a man who had, by credible accounts, made people in 3 countries acutely nervous, a man with ink up his neck and a reputation that preceded him into rooms like a temperature drop, crouched over a changing mat with the expression of someone defusing an unfamiliar device, that bypassed her defenses entirely. She pressed her mouth flat. It didn't work. He looked up at exactly the wrong moment, caught the suppressed laugh she failed to fully suppress, and something happened in his expression that she hadn't seen since before everything had broken, a loosening, brief and unguarded, like a window opened in a room that had been shut too long. He didn't comment on it. Neither did she. By the 3rd day, he had the process down with the grim efficiency of a man who approached all problems the same way: assess, adapt, execute. By the 4th, he was handling the midnight shift without being asked. It was Kenzo who finished him. Colicky, inconsolable, screaming at 2 in the morning with an intensity that seemed to question the structural integrity of the entire building, Xylia stood in the doorway and watched Vane pace the length of the kitchen with his son against his chest, one large hand spread across Kenzo's back, murmuring something low and rhythmic in Korean that she couldn't quite hear. Kenzo screamed anyway. Vane kept pacing. Kept murmuring. Didn't stop, didn't hand him off, didn't do anything except stay, and that, she understood, watching from the doorway in the dark, was the thing he'd never managed to offer her in 3 years of marriage. Not control. Not provision. Just presence, without an exit. The message came through on a Friday afternoon while Vane was on the kitchen floor assembling a second-hand baby gym Xylia had found at a thrift store 3 blocks away, something she'd mentioned once, in passing, not as a request but simply as information, and he had apparently filed it and gone and purchased the identical model without comment. She hadn't decided how she felt about that yet. She was folding laundry on the couch when his phone lit up on the counter. She wasn't looking at it. She didn't need to. She knew the precise quality of silence that followed it, the way his hands stopped moving, the way the room's atmosphere changed in the subtle, pressurized way of weather preceding a storm. She looked up. His face had closed. Every open thing she'd spent 5 days watching emerge, the patience, the humor he kept mostly hidden, the unguarded expression of a man holding his son in the dark, was gone. What remained was the version of Vane she recognized from before. Still. Controlled. Dangerous in the way of something that has stopped announcing itself. "What happened?" she said. Not a question. He stood slowly and turned the phone face down on the counter. "I need you to take the boys upstairs." Vane. Xylia. The first time in 5 days he'd used that tone with her. Quiet and absolute. "Please take the boys upstairs." She heard the please and moved. She was on the second stair when he said her name again, and she turned. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to communicate something neither of them had the words for yet, and then he looked away. She took the boys upstairs. What she understood, assembled from fragments over the following hour, his voice through the floor, low and precise and nothing like the men who had paced the kitchen murmuring Korean lullabies, was that someone had talked. A location. The townhouse address, routed through channels that were supposed to be sealed, delivered to a faction operating under a man named Seo Dae-hoon who had been circling Vane's territory for 8 months and waiting for the precise moment when Vane's attention was most divided. That moment, apparently, was now. She sat on the floor of the bedroom with her back against the cot, Kai in her lap and Kenzo pressed to her side, and felt the fear arrive not as panic but as clarity, sharp and cold and thorough, illuminating every corner. This was what she had run from. Not Vane's temper, not his control, not even the gilded immobility of life inside the Castiglione household. This. The moment when loving the wrong man made your children into leverage. The door opened. Vane filled the frame, jacket on now, everything about him reconfigured into someone who operated in a world she'd tried to keep her sons from inheriting. He looked at her on the floor with the boys, and something moved through his expression too quickly to name. "I'm getting you out tonight," he said. "And then what?" Her voice was steady. She needed it to be steady. He crouched down to her level, something she had never once seen him do for anyone, and met her eyes with the directness of a man who had, perhaps, finally stopped calculating what the truth would cost him. "And then I finish it," he said. "For good." They moved at 9 p.m. through a route Xylia wasn't shown in advance, which 3 weeks ago would have confirmed every fear she carried. Now she sat in the back seat with a twin on each side in their car seats and watched the city slide past the tinted windows and understood, in a way she hadn't before, the difference between being controlled and being protected. She was still working out whether that distinction was meaningful or simply sophisticated captivity rebranded. She was still working it out when Vane made the first call. She only heard his side of it. Korean, low and unhurried, with that particular quality of stillness that she now recognized as the register he used when the stakes were highest, not louder, never louder, but denser, every word placed with the precision of something load-bearing. She didn't speak Korean. She didn't need to. She had learned to read Vane Castiglione the way you learn to read weather, not through translation but through atmosphere, through the particular pressure of the air around him. What she heard in that car was not cruelty. It wasn't the performance of power she'd witnessed at Castiglione dinners, where men spoke loudly enough to be overheard, shaping their reputations in real time. This was the opposite. This was a man speaking quietly because the people listening already understood the weight behind the words, and anything louder would have been redundant. By the time they reached the second location, a secured apartment she suspected he'd maintained for exactly this category of emergency, 3 more calls had been made and received. He opened her door without her asking. Carried both car seats up the stairs without comment. Over the following 2 days, information came to her in pieces she hadn't requested but couldn't avoid. Seo Dae-hoon's network had been dismantled with a comprehensiveness that went beyond retaliation and into something more deliberate, the systematic removal of a threat from its root structure rather than its visible branches. No one had been killed. She asked, directly, because she needed to know, and Vane had met her eyes and said no, and she believed him in the way she believed the things he said when he'd stopped managing her perception of them. What he had done instead was use the one currency his reputation afforded him that required no violence at all, certainty. The absolute, well-documented certainty of what happened to people who reached toward something of his. The tattoos, the name, the carefully constructed mythology of consequence, all of it directed, for the first time she had witnessed, outward. Away from her. Between her children and the world that wanted to use them. She found him on the apartment's small balcony on the second evening, watching the street below the way he always watched things, thoroughly, without appearing to. "It's done," he said, without turning. She stood beside him. Didn't touch him. But didn't leave either. "I know what you are," she said quietly. "I've always known." He was still. "What I didn't know," she continued, "was whether what you were could ever point in a direction that didn't cost me something." The street below moved through its ordinary business, indifferent. "And now?" he asked. Xylia looked at her son sleeping through the glass behind them, safe, warm, unaware of the architecture of sacrifice that surrounded them, and gave him the only honest answer she had. "Now I'm not sure the question is as simple as I needed it to be." She started packing on a Tuesday. Not frantically, she was long past the version of herself who packed frantically. This was the methodical, practiced efficiency of a woman who had done this before and understood that survival favored the organized. 2 bags, the same number she'd left with the first time. Essentials for the boys first, then her own things, then the small folder of documents she kept in the inner pocket of the larger bag, birth certificates, her own identification, the paperwork that established Kai and Kenzo Brooks as belonging to themselves and to her. She wasn't running from danger this time. The threat had been handled. She understood that. What she was running from was the slow, almost imperceptible process of being drawn back into an orbit she had exited at enormous cost, and the frightening realization that the orbit had changed enough that she was no longer entirely certain she wanted to stay outside it. That uncertainty was the most dangerous thing she'd felt in 8 months. She had the second bag half filled when she heard the knock. She didn't move for a moment, standing in the center of the room with a folded sleep suit in her hands, and then she set it down and opened the door. Vane looked at the bags without expression. She had expected something, the controlled displeasure, the careful negotiation. What she had not expected was for him to simply reach into the interior pocket of his jacket and hold out an envelope. She didn't take it immediately. "What is this?" "Open it." She did. The documents were dense and formal, multiple pages bearing the letterhead of a legal firm she didn't recognize, but the language was clear enough that she understood the architecture of it within the first paragraph. Asset transfer. Properties, accounts, holdings, the material infrastructure of everything Vane Castiglione had built or inherited, restructured with her name and the boys' names as primary beneficiaries. Not a gift. Not a settlement with conditions buried in the subclauses. A transfer, clean and irrevocable, executed and notarized 3 days ago. She read it twice. "This doesn't make sense," she said finally. "It makes complete sense." He leaned against the doorframe, not blocking it, she noted, positioned to one side. "You left because you had no power inside that structure. Everything was mine, which meant you existed at my discretion. That was wrong." He said it the way he said things he'd arrived at through rigorous, private examination, without theatrics, without the performance of humility. Simply as a fact he had processed and accepted. "I'm not interested in correcting the past. I can't. But I can make sure the present has different terms." "You can't buy your way back in," she said. "I know that." His eyes met hers. "This isn't currency, Xylia. This is me removing myself as a variable you have to calculate around. Whether you stay or go, whether you ever let me be anything to you beyond the boy's father, you will never again be in a position where your safety depends on my goodwill." The apartment was quiet. Kai had pulled himself to standing against the couch behind her, a new development that still made her heart seize slightly every time, and was regarding his father with the intense, owlish focus of a person processing new information. She looked down at the documents again. At her name, printed cleanly in formal typeface, where his had been before. "You should know," she said quietly, "that this changes the question I've been asking." He waited. "I've been asking whether you could change." She folded the documents carefully along their original creases. "This doesn't tell me who you are now. It tells me who you're trying to become." She looked up at him. "Those aren't the same thing." "No," he agreed. "They're not." The bags sat half-packed on the floor behind her. She didn't touch them again that night. The house had a garden. That was the thing Xylia kept returning to in the first days after they moved in, not the space, not the quiet neighborhood, not even the absence of the security infrastructure she'd spent 3 years learning to navigate like furniture in a dark room. The garden. Overgrown at the edges in a way that suggested the previous owners had loved it and then gotten busy, with a wooden gate that latched from either side, and a patch of lawn where the afternoon light sat for approximately 3 hours on clear days, which she knew because she had stood there and timed it. She had also checked every window in the house. No bars. Just glass, and light, and the ordinary world beyond them. She didn't tell Vane she'd checked. She suspected he already knew. The months between the documents and the house had not been simple. Nothing between them had ever been simple, and she had made her peace with the fact that simple was probably not a thing their particular history was capable of generating. What they had managed, incrementally and without ceremony, was something more durable than simple, a series of small, deliberate choices made daily, the way you tended things that mattered. Shared mornings. Honest conversations that didn't always end cleanly but ended honestly. The gradual, careful construction of trust between two people who understood exactly how badly trust could be broken because they had broken it comprehensively, together, and survived it. The twins' first birthday fell on a Saturday in early spring. Xylia had made the cake herself, slightly lopsided, with blue frosting applied by someone who had watched 2 tutorial videos and still overestimated her own piping technique. It was the best cake she had ever produced and objectively not a beautiful object, and she was unreasonably proud of it. Kai destroyed his portion with focused, wholehearted commitment. Kenzo ate approximately 4 bites and then used the remainder as an exploratory medium. Xylia photographed all of it with the slightly overwhelmed attention of a woman who understood, in her bones, the specific fragility of ordinary joy. She found Vane in the garden afterward, in the late afternoon light, his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, sitting on the low stone step with the particular stillness of a man alone with something he'd been carrying for a long time. He heard her come out and turned, and she saw it before he spoke, the thing he'd been arranging inside himself, the decision already made, the only remaining question being whether he had the courage to make it without the armor of certainty. He didn't reach for her hand. He looked at her, and he asked. Not the way he'd done everything before, not with the implicit understanding that the answer was a formality. He asked the way a person asks when they already know refusal is a genuine possibility and have decided the asking matters more than the outcome. She was quiet long enough that a bird somewhere in the overgrown hedge completed an entire thought. I need you to understand something first, she said. He waited. If I say yes, it is not because I owe you a second chance, or because I'm grateful, or because I've run out of options. She held his gaze. It would be because I choose it. Fully. With everything I know about you, the before and the after both. I know, he said. That's the only yes I want. The afternoon light moved across the garden. Then yes, she said. Kai took his first unassisted steps on a Sunday morning, crossing the kitchen floor with the determined, slightly incredulous expression of someone who had just discovered that the laws of physics were negotiable. Vane was there for it. That was the part that mattered. Not summoned, not updated afterward through a phone call or a photograph sent across a secured line. Present, coffee in hand, jacket off, bare feet on the kitchen tile, when his son let go of the cabinet edge and crossed 6 feet of open floor on his own power for the first time. He set the coffee down so carefully it didn't make a sound. And when Kai reached him and grabbed 2 fistfuls of his shirt with the triumphant grip of someone who had achieved something enormous, Vane crouched down and held him with both hands and said nothing at all. Xylia watched from the doorway and understood that she was witnessing something that had no name in the language of the world Vane had come from. That world had a vocabulary for acquisition, for legacy, for the inheritance of power and the consolidation of territory. It did not have a word for this, for a man choosing, daily and without audience, to be present for the small unremarkable architecture of his children's lives. For showing up not because it was required or strategic or even natural to him, but because he had decided it was who he intended to become. Becoming, she had learned, was not a moment. It was a practice. It was the accumulated weight of 10,000 ordinary choices made in the direction of the person you were trying to be, with no guarantee that the distance between who you were and who you were reaching for would ever fully close. Vane was still, in certain lights, the man he'd been raised to be. She didn't pretend otherwise. The instinct toward control didn't vanish because you'd decided to resist it. The patterns laid down across a childhood and a young adulthood and 34 years of navigating a world that rewarded fear didn't dissolve because you'd signed legal documents and planted a garden. They required maintenance. Vigilance. The willingness to catch yourself and correct without defending. He was doing that work. She watched him do it daily, imperfectly, without quitting. She was doing her own. The hyper-independence, the reflex to carry everything alone until she buckled, she recognized it now as armor rather than strength, and recognized the difference between the two things, and was learning, slowly, to set selected pieces of it down. This was what none of the stories she'd grown up with had told her, that the most difficult thing was never the dramatic confrontation or the grand gesture, but the quiet, unremarkable daily commitment to building something worth keeping. That the breaking of a pattern handed down through generations required no audience, no acknowledgement, only the decision made again each morning to be the place where a harmful thing stopped. Outside, the garden was beginning to come back. Kenzo was attempting to eat a board book with great seriousness. Kai had relocated to his father's shoulders. Vane stood at the window with his son above him and one hand steadying small feet against his collarbone, looking out at the yard with the expression of a man surveying something he had not conquered but chosen. There was a difference. He understood that now. So did she.